This is a picture or painting of the destruction of the Maine. We might note that obviously it is done for dramatic effect. You can clearly see the bodies of the American sailors flying through the air to their deaths. I'm not sure that if we were to see this live and in person that it would have looked quite like that, but obviously the artist is interested in kind of tugging at our heartstrings and emphasizing the human toll of this disaster. But I want to point out that archaeologists and historians in studying the Maine have determined that in fact it was not attacked by the Spanish, as everyone presumed at that time. In fact, it was some sort of problem in the boiler room, in the holds of the ship. One of the boilers exploded, and that set alight all of the armaments and explosives down below in the ship. And so, in fact, this was not carried out by the Spanish. But in historical terms, that almost doesn't matter, because what everyone thought and assumed was that the Spanish had done it, and so we were going to act on that assumption. And as we will see, what that means is a declaration of war against Spain. After the destruction of the Maine, it seems almost inevitable that the United States was going to declare war. McKinley attempted one last time to patch up relations with Spain, but those efforts fell short. And on April 21st, 1898, McKinley declared war. Ambassador John Hay, even at that time, referred to what becomes known as the Spanish-American War, or the Spanish-Cuban-American War, as a splendid little war. We might note that those terms are almost oxymorons. Can any war be splendid? Can any war, in fact, be little? But this tells you a good bit about how the war was viewed and, in fact, how the war was carried out. When John Hay refers to this war as a splendid little war, what he means is that it was relatively short-lived, relatively one-sided, and was, in fact, a resounding victory for the United States. So in terms of the combat, we might point out a few things. I mentioned the war was relatively brief, lasted from April through August in 1898. The first major battle of the war was a naval engagement, the Battle for Manila. And actually the painting that you see here is a nice dramatic rendering of what that battle might have looked like. And the United States achieved a quick victory in Manila. This is the capital city in the Philippines, all the way across the Pacific. The other battle of note is known as the Battle of San Juan Hill, or San Juan Heights, and this has been cemented in American memory because it was the scene of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Teddy Roosevelt leading the charge up San Juan Hill. Teddy Roosevelt, and we'll talk much more about him shortly, was already known as this very robust, outgoing, outdoorsy sort of figure. And when the Spanish-American War broke out, Roosevelt recruited a corps drawn largely from his old football buddies and other friends from his college days, known as the Rough Riders, and he led them into battle, charging up San Juan Hill. Well, this war, known as a splendid little war, ended on August 12th, 1898. But for being a splendid little war, we might note that more than 5,000 Americans died, about 5,400 Americans died. 379 of those were combat deaths. The other 5,000 plus died, as perhaps you can imagine, from disease, particularly malaria and yellow fever. Remember, this war is being fought largely in Cuba or in the Philippines, places like that. in the dead of summer. It's incredibly hot. It's incredibly humid, tropical conditions. Mosquitoes were everywhere, and disease ran rampant. And so conditions during this war, even though it is short-lived, even though it is a one-sided victory for the United States, the conditions were horrific. The United States achieved victory in the Spanish-American War, and that victory was sealed in the Treaty of Paris, 1898, which ended the war. This is truly a momentous moment in American history, a great turning point moment in American history, because it marks the moment when the United States crosses that boundary from a sort of isolated nation keeping to its own devices to becoming an imperial nation and in many ways a world power. So the Treaty of Paris in 1898 is a tremendously important treaty in our history. In essence, what it does is marks Spain's defeat and our victory. And so the United States is going to take from Spain at the end of this war a number of what remained of Spain's colonies at that time, notably Puerto Rico, Guam, and Wake Island. And Puerto Rico clearly the most important among these. I'll show you a map in a few moments, but Puerto Rico really is the gateway to the Caribbean, and it becomes a very important American outpost. The United States also obtained the Philippines in similar fashion, although it was noted at the time that this was a purchase. The United States paid $15 million to obtain the Philippines. That was thought to be important in the sense that the United States had not fought this war as an imperial war to claim colonies, even though that is essentially what they're doing. And Cuba, we must note, becomes independent at the end of this war. The United States does not obtain Cuba like it does these other colonies. And again, there had been much to do heading into the war that the United States was not interested in taking Cuba as a colony. Many American congressmen, if they were going to support the war, they wanted it made clear the United States was not going to take Cuba. And yet, in an interesting twist, and we're going to have to talk more about this as we go along, the United States really didn't want to see Cuba independent. I mentioned previously, the United States didn't necessarily object to Spain maintaining control. What they objected to was the methods that Spain was using. And now in the aftermath, Cuba is independent, but the United States had grave concerns about an independent Cuba. We were convinced, and again, this goes back to the racist ideology of the day, we were convinced that Cuba would not be able to handle itself, that Cuba would fall into chaos and anarchy, and that there would be all kinds of problems down there. And so the United States, in the interest of overseeing affairs in Cuba, maintaining some sense of control in Cuba, the United States forced the Cubans, as they wrote their new constitution in 1901, to accept something called the Platt Amendment. It's a very important idea, so note this. Platt Amendment in 1901, written into the Cuban Constitution. This amendment said that the United States had the authority to intervene in Cuba whenever it saw fit. The precise wording is perhaps even a little more interesting. The United States has the right to intervene in Cuba whenever Cuba's independence is threatened. That's an interesting twist, right? The United States can intervene when Cuba's independence is threatened. Essentially, this gives the United States carte blanche. Anytime we think we need to intervene in Cuba, for whatever reasons, we have the right to do that. And in fact, the United States did intervene in Cuba many times over the life of this amendment. It eventually was abrogated by both sides in the 1930s. That is, it was done away with in the 1930s. But between this time and then, the United States intervened in Cuba many times. We'll look for a moment at a couple of images derived from this war. This is one image depicting the charge up San Juan Hill, or San Juan Heights. One of the things that is always pointed out in this image is the prominence of African American soldiers, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, who were frequently stationed at the front of the line, and there were accusations of using black soldiers as cannon fodder, so to speak. And you do see in this picture a number of them have fallen. We might also note the figure on the right-hand side of the picture riding the horse, which we may presume to be Teddy Roosevelt, although it's not certain from this picture. Here we have a much clearer rendering of Teddy Roosevelt in his heroic moment. Again, the charge up San Juan Hill. Here he is with his Rough Riders. And again, you can read into this as much as you like, but clearly the war itself would not have looked quite like this either. We have high drama, Teddy Roosevelt, pristine and clean, standing bright front and center in this picture as explosions and whatnot go off around him. I'm sure that the war in actuality was much dirtier than this and didn't look quite so glamorous. But recall that it is in the wake of this war that Teddy Roosevelt becomes probably the most famous figure in America, becoming one of its great heroes, and not long after this, in fact, becoming President of the United States. And this map gives you a sense of the growing reach of the United States abroad. Again, we are moving past that isolationist tradition that had defined United States diplomacy up to this point. We see in the 1890s especially any number of cases in which the United States annexed territories, and in particular you can see those places that were taken over after the Spanish-American War. So you look west across the Pacific, Wake Island, Guam, and of course the Philippines. The Hawaiian Islands right there in the middle in the little box, also formally taken in 1898, although the annexation occurred in 1893, but the annexation was signed by McKinley in 1898. And then if you look to the east or the right-hand side, you may see Puerto Rico, which, as I mentioned, is the gateway of the Caribbean and stretches American influence in another direction. So just note that this whole idea marks a tremendous transition in America's view of itself and America's role in the world. We now have all of these colonies spreading across the globe. There are people in all of these places. In many cases, they were independent. They have their own governments. They have their own ways of doing things. And now we are going to have to figure out, how are we going to control them? What does all of this mean?